What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 230. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Dave DeCamp returns to the show today to talk Yemen, Iran, and China Houthis, and we really nailed down on the China Houthis, who get credit for being not war Houthis because they're dovish on other issues like opposing some war in the Middle East or not wanting to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. So, Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, Joe Kent, Matt Gaetz, Khanna, all these people fall into that category, and it makes their anti-China rhetoric so much more potent and problematic. So me and Dave break all that down on today's show. I think everybody's going to love the show. Share it if you can. It's at the Libertarian Institute. We post it on the blog at antiwar.com. Find the video version at Rumble, Odyssey, or YouTube. You can find the audio version anywhere you listen to podcasts or on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. I want to mention at the Institute, I have a new article out with Will Porter on sanctions, and I am writing short news stories every day as part of my news roundup at the Libertarian Institute. So check out all that work. Please share it if you can. Get it out there to more people. I think myself and Will and Dave all have a really important message. And so, help us out by sharing. Last, you could donate to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Crypto. All that information is in the show notes page, as well as by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo show code PEACE. That saves you 25%, and it gets the show a kickback when you spend $75 or more. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. I love the soft gels. The gummies taste good. They're, low dose, so just a little bit of CBD to get you through whatever you have going on. A little bit more, you want a little bit more CBD. The soft gels work well, or the maximum dose, the tinctures, can really get you the level of CBD that you need to help you get to sleep at night, help you get some anxiety reduction, or some pain reduction. So a lot of great stuff, a lot of ways that CBD could help you. Go to PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE. Help yourself out. Help the show. All right, let's get into the interview with Dave DeCamp. Hey, Dave, how's it going? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest.
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back on.
Excited to have you because you've been writing a ton of good stuff at antiwar.com. And I got, I think, 4 of your pieces here today. Want to talk about Yemen first, where the war has really accelerated and very quietly under the Biden administration. You write, Yemen, January saw highest civilian casualties in Saudi air war since 2016. Dave, what's happening here? Because I thought a year ago, Joe Biden said the U.S. was actually ending its offensive support for the Saudi war in Yemen.
Well, yeah. So January, anybody that's been paying attention, we all heard about that Saudi airstrike on a prison in Yemen. It was a migrant detention facility that killed, according to the Yemen Data Project, they compile data on Saudi airstrikes every month, and they email us. You can get on the email list. They send out monthly summaries. And I think that this aligns with the numbers from the sources on the ground, the aid groups that were there. It said 91 civilians were killed in that airstrike on the migrant detention facility. And that was preceded by the Saudis bombing some telecommunication infrastructure, which knocked out the internet nationwide in Yemen, making it, the media coverage of the war is already, there's a big media blackout on it, and it's really tough for people in Yemen to get their story out. So right before this big escalation, the Saudis bombed the internet out. And that airstrike also killed a few civilians. I believe 2 children that were playing soccer nearby. I mean, this is really horrific stuff. So yeah, according to their data, and they've been compiling it since 2015, since the war started. January 2022 was the most violent month for civilians since October 2016. And for those that remember it's always been a brutal, horrible war, but the early days of the war, the airstrikes were really bad, really horrific. So, I mean, this is really kind of demonstrates just how major this escalation has been. In
So
total, it's
just real quick, two
mhm.
questions. The first is, do you have any idea if the bombing of the telecommunications facility was intentional to knock out the internet? Did Saudi Arabia say why they were targeting that facility? And just because we've seen in particularly Tigray, Ethiopia, and in Kashmir that the shutting off, and in Sudan that shutting off the internet has been a precursor for the ruling governments there to carry out crimes against the civilian population, right? They knock out the internet, that it makes it a hell of a lot harder to get any of that information into the hands of journalists or particularly anyone in the West to report on what's happening.
It's tough to say if they did it intentionally. I'm not sure. They said that they were just targeting military targets, which is clearly not true. I would have to look back. Jason wrote up something about this strike, and it was known that this tower in Hodeidah was kind of the key to the country's internet. So so there's a chance that they did know. But also, the Saudis they're not the best strategists. So I don't think they're even really smart enough to know that they could take out the internet by bombing that tower. But it's definitely possible.
And then I also just was curious that maybe the numbers here are a little bit, I don't know, off, just because if you October of 2016 was when they bombed that funeral in Sana'a and killed like 150 something people. And so I was just curious that maybe it's just these are the particular months that have atrocities that are so what I mean, like they're one mass event, and so all those civilian deaths get counted, where in between this time a bunch of civilians were dying, and maybe even in greater numbers, but because it's 3 civilians here, 2 civilians there, they don't get counted like they do when it's just, again, it seems like that's really the only time where the numbers really get well documented is when Saudi Arabia blows up a school bus full of 50 children, blows up a funeral, a wedding, or a party or something like that. But those smaller strikes, they kind of just get away with saying, they were Houthi.
Yeah, no, that's true. But if you look through, you could go on their website, the Yemen Data Project, and they have a spreadsheet of all the airstrikes they've recorded, and it's not all of them. And these are, I believe, lower end estimates. They don't know for sure. They're pretty conservative with their numbers. So you had 91 in that one strike, and for the total of the whole month, it was 139 civilians were killed, and about 287 were wounded. So there was also strikes that people should get on this email list, because they have good graphs and charts that show all the civilian infrastructure that they recorded being bombed. Some hospitals were bombed. They said a food storage unit, a food truck, residential areas, and did I say hospitals? They said 2 hospitals were struck. So this is a pattern that we've seen throughout the whole war. These little strikes are always happening, even if they're not killing civilians. They're still targeting civilian infrastructure. It's happened the whole time, and more people notice, obviously, with these mass casualty events. They said that this latest strike, was the 3rd most violent, the 3rd highest civilian casualty rate of any single air raid in the war. So, and this came after the Houthis launched a few missiles and drones at the UAE. One strike killed 3 people. I believe they were migrant workers at the oil facilities that they hit. So that's kind of the justification for this escalation. But, missing always the context from the Western media reports, from what the Saudis and the Emiratis say. This war has been going on since 2015, and the Houthis, they wouldn't be doing these attacks if not for that. It's simple. It sounds silly to have to say, but I think it's really worth repeating a lot. Because you could say, the Houthis killed civilians, but it's clearly a response. And the UAE, they downplay their role in the war, in the coalition. They're not as involved in the bombings as they used to be, from what I understand, or they say so. They could just be lying. But they have always supported militants on the ground, and they've been backing this group called the Giants Brigade that's been having success against the Houthis. And the UAE, there's very extensive reporting, probably repeating myself, stuff I said the last time I was on your show, but that they funded that Al Qaeda fighters to be part of these militias against the Houthis. This is documented. These are facts. So in response to all this, the Biden administration has escalated its role in the war, and they sent the USS Cole. Out of all the ships they could have sent to this area was the USS Cole, which was attacked off the coast of Yemen before 9/11. One of the first major Al Qaeda attacks against the U.S. So, and F-22s, they said General McKenzie, the head of CENTCOM, was just in the UAE, and he's saying, we got to work with you guys, work on technology so you can pretty much so that they could hit the Houthi drones and missiles before they're launched so they could bomb Yemen more is pretty much what they're saying. And yeah, so the U.S. is really, as the Saudis are escalating the air war, the U.S. is escalating its role. It's been over a year since Biden said he would end support for the war, and it's clearly hasn't happened. And his State Department, they just approved a few arms sales for the Saudis and the UAE that will upgrade their missile defense systems. So the arms sale continue, support for Saudi Air Force continues, and now we got some new warships and warplanes there. And, the U.S. has been intercepting missiles since the Houthis started the attacks in the UAE, so they're directly involved militarily in the war.
Yeah. When we were talking about on the show even before it happened, Dave, that the UAE was backing the Giants Brigade, and I was saying, like, hey, whenever you back a Salafist militia and launch an attack against a group, well, then there might be some repercussions from that. And I was kind of surprised that it got as far as it did, where they were actually able to like hit sites in the UAE with these drones. But that is somewhat significant, right? That they are able to hit the UAE, because Saudi Arabia and most of the targets, I believe, are on the Saudi like West Red Sea coast, which are closer to the northern Yemen areas, that the Houthis hold. So I don't know. Do you see any? I know in the past the U.S. has had some direct attacks against the Houthi. I think it was only after the U.S. or the Houthi apparently target U.S. ships that were enforcing the blockade of Yemen in the Red Sea, and they hit a few sites after that. But do you think the U.S. is actually looking at any direct action against the Houthi, or are they just talking about potentially giving them support within the country? I think, Biden just had the big announcement, of course, billions in weapons, jets to the Jordanians, but also upgrading the Emirati and the Saudi air defense systems.
Yeah, I think it's possible that the U.S. might start attacking the Houthis directly. They haven't been saying that. They're not really coming under much criticism for the war in Yemen right now. There's been some good writing on it and stuff, but I don't really see much pressure in Congress. It seems like they've bought the defensive narrative, as you saw that from they couldn't block a recent missile sale in the Senate to the Saudis, and you had people like Chris Murphy that were opposed to these arms sales change their mind and buy this narrative that it's defensive in nature. They don't want to upset the Democratic administration too much. So yeah, it's kind of things can really escalate from here because the Houthis aren't going to back down. And it really shows their success at hitting targets inside the UAE, inside Saudi Arabia. It shows that the blockade on Yemen has done nothing to slow their weapons advances, and it's just starving people. And then that gets into I think the next article you wanted to talk about was the fact that the White House recently had a meeting on redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. So that was a move made by the Trump administration in the final weeks, and it basically blacklists all the Houthis. It makes you, if you do business with the Houthis, if they're labeled a terrorist organization, that opens you up for U.S. sanctions. Houthi, I doubt any Houthi leaders have assets in the U.S., so sanctions against them, terror designation against them, it does nothing to hurt them. But what it will do is discourage businesses and banks from processing transactions with the Houthis, and it could essentially criminalize the delivery of food to Yemen's starving civilian population, and most of them live in the areas of North Yemen that the Houthis control. So it won't do anything to the Houthis really, and all it could do is push more Yemenis into starvation. So it's really just cruel and unnecessary. And they would be doing it at the behest of the UAE, because the UAE requested it after these recent Houthi attacks. Um, so yeah, it's really about, as if that happens, I mean, things are just gonna get about as bad as they could be in Yemen.
Yeah, and I remember, I think the last time this happened last year, the one of the points made by the aid groups was Yemen, I think, is the most reliant country in the world on remittance, people sending money back to their family in Yemen. Like, that's how a lot of people get income. And designating the Houthis a foreign terror group will basically make it so no companies will transact those small things, right? Because when you can't run the risk of some guy sending money to Yemen and it going to AQAP, right? And so you're just gonna cut it off completely. Any money going to northern Yemen can't happen, can't go to the Houthis and everything. So they cut off these kind of transactions when the U.S. Announces these kind of sanctions. So I think that it was one of the warnings last time. I'm guessing it's still a major issue. Dave, anything else on Yemen? I mean, you mentioned that you really don't see any action in Congress. I saw that I think Rep. Jim McGovern had proposed something where we would end offensive support to Saudi Arabia but maintain defensive support, and so just kind of enshrining this Biden policy into law. But they did announce a new arms sale to Saudi Arabia, and while it is missile defense upgrades, maybe Rand Paul, maybe somebody will make a big deal about this and try to block these things. But do you have any hope for that?
Um, for the missile defense, that those sales, I don't really think anybody's going to take action against it. Just because it didn't really make any headlines. Nobody seemed to really notice. So, I mean, that's the thing. More people just have to be aware of what's happening and have to share these numbers and just see how there's this huge escalation. And it's not defensive in any sense of the word, anything that's happening here. And it's accomplishing nothing. So more people just got to spread the word and, get the word out and kind of do a better job, because there is a lot of grassroots organizations in DC for all the things that happen in that city. That one of the best campaigns in recent years was the push to end the war in Yemen. So hopefully, we should get more involved and encourage that kind of stuff.
Yep. All right, Dave, let's talk about Iran. You have a couple articles from yesterday here. The first one I want to talk about is titled "White House Warns Time Running Out to Revive Iran Deal." Dave, I feel like they've been saying we're weeks away from having to, the Iran deal. We can't return to it for a couple months now. So I'm not sure how seriously you're taking the U.S. threats. However, I have seen more and more reporting from places like the Wall Street Journal and these mainstream news outlets that the U.S. does, or at least people within the U.S. are assessing that the breakout time for Iran's nuclear program is less than a year, which me and doesn't mean anything, but for the debate in D.C. it may be quite important. So what's going on here?
Yeah. I would be really shocked. I mean, so Psaki, they've been warning this the whole time since the talks ended. Since the talks resumed at the end of November, that, we have a short time. The talking point is that if Iran makes more nuclear advancements, the JCPOA would be kind of useless. It wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. But that's just not true at all, because Iran will bring its nuclear program into the limits of the JCPOA. The idea is they say, they're like gaining more knowledge about how to make a nuclear weapon, I guess, but they're not trying to make a nuclear weapon. So it's all just that talking point is total nonsense, but it plays well in the U.S. media. And then the breakout time thing, that's also just nonsense. But what the big problem is the opposition in Congress. I mean, you have pretty much every Republican is against it, and you have Bob Menendez, who's pretty influential, who's also very against it. So, and Iran has to look at this too, because this is a big thing for them, is the guarantees that the next administration, they want guarantees the next administration won't pull out of the deal. Well, Republicans, yeah, it's tough to predict things. Things can change very quick when it comes to electoral politics, but Republicans are looking pretty good for the next presidential election with what's been happening with Biden. So from Iran's perspective, they might only have a short window of this sanctions relief, and judging by how long the U.S. can take to lift sanctions, they might not even get them all lifted within 2 years or 3 years. So Iran's not going to really make any big concessions to the U.S., I don't think, to get the U.S. to rejoin the deal, because in the long term, they can't really plan their economy based around this deal that might be gone soon. So at the same time, the U.S. officials, the line now, they're saying a deal is in sight. A deal for all parties is in sight. Something could happen soon. Um, but I don't know, just the way that the pressure is against the deal in Washington, and just the reality of it, and the fact that Iran will just see little benefit even if the sanctions are lifted, doesn't give me much hope for it.
Yeah. So yeah, it seems to me that Biden made a huge mistake here, Dave. That getting back into the deal when he first took over the presidency would have been a lot easier, but now he's waited so long that with the maximum pressure campaign that Biden has added sanctions to as president. It's not just that he sat on his hands. He sat on his hands while Israel launched asymmetric warfare attacks against Iran, and then he added his own sanctions to Iran. So Iran continued to advance their civilian nuclear energy program by installing new centrifuges and everything like that. And my understanding is the Iranians are saying this time that they're unwilling to destroy those centrifuges. And so the U.S. argument is that even if Iran ships off all of its enriched uranium, with its ability to enrich uranium to 60%, which they've now proven, they could theoretically have enough enriched uranium to produce a bomb in 4 to 6 months. However, the whole conversation isn't relevant because Iran doesn't have a bomb, and even having enough enriched uranium to make a bomb doesn't mean that you have one. There's still quite a few steps between those two processes that everybody seems to just like to jump and forget. But anyways, now the Houthis have, I think, enough ammunition, especially with it being a new government in Iran that is less friendly towards the West at the very least. And so I think Biden has put himself in a really tough place on this issue. And for the Iranians, he's put them in a really tough place as well, because now he's drug his feet so long that the Houthis are just going to go crazy and threaten the Iranians directly like they did in 2014, 2015. Hell, back then even Rand Paul was signing letters to the Iranian government saying, don't get into the deal because the Republican president is just going to pull the plug on. Don't do it. And so I can see all that kind of stuff happening, and the Iranians saying, well, you know what, that's a pretty damn good point. And so, yeah, never mind about this.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you have also the pressure from Israel. Another thing I wrote up recently was Biden and Bennett, the Israeli prime minister. They spoke the other day on the phone, and this was from Axios. Some sources told them that Bennett pretty much said to Biden, don't join the deal. You don't have to do it. It's interesting. He said that Iran's nuclear program won't necessarily advance if the deal isn't revived, which is funny because you always hear the Israelis warning that they're racing to make a bomb, but now that he's really trying to convince Biden not to do it, he kind of changes his tune. So that's a whole nother element to it. Biden also told Bennett that that he supports Israel's freedom of action against Iran, which kind of signals that they might back some potential military or covert action against the Iranians. And these are all signals to Iran, and they're not good signals. So they're just not giving them much to work with here.
Yeah, yeah. So this really, I had to read it a couple times, Dave, just to make sure I was reading this right yesterday. Because as you say, the Israeli warning is always that Iran is going to build a bomb, that the Iran nuclear deal doesn't constrain Iran enough, and that if it wasn't for the crippling sanctions that the U.S. currently has against Iran, would have a nuclear bomb. And it seems that Israel is basically admitting that all those things just simply aren't true. They're saying that Iran isn't racing to build a bomb. It's not some kind of deal keeping them from getting them, and they say Iran isn't going to build it with or without sanctions. And so that's that seems all really problematic. Now, one more thing I want to mention to you and just hear your take on. FDD's Mark Dubowitz said that here's the problem: if we get back into the deal now, it will lift sanctions on Iran. And then in 5 or 6 years, Iran will do, he doesn't say this, but Iran will do what Russia did, sanction proof its economy. And then the U.S. will have no leverage on Iran to prevent them from making, or no peaceful leverage on Iran to prevent them from making a nuclear bomb, like applying sanctions. And we'll have no choice but to go to war. And that's kind of the Houthis argument, I guess, now that, why we can't return to the deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what they're trying to do now is sanctions proof their economy. Um, because they can't rely on the U.S. to keep sanctions off. So even if um, they return to the deal, there is some truth to that they're still going to try to sanctions proof their economy, but that makes sense. I mean, I don't see what other option they really have. Um, and as the U.S. is pushing all of its, so-called enemies closer together, there is like some real avenues for Iran to take with Russia and China. And as they're working on this kind of alternate global financial economic system. But that's all entirely the U.S. is doing, and that there's no reason we would have to go to war with them, even if like that's just all nonsense. It's not like they're gonna make a nuke or anything or try to destroy Israel like Dubowitz says. Um, but yeah, I mean, these policies, the pressure, I mean, that's what's going to cause any of that situation that Iran, seeking alternatives. Uh, and that's already started. This whole time you hear Iranian officials, they say they want to restore the deal. They're willing to go back into the JCPOA if the U.S. lifts sanctions, but they're also working for alternatives. And you see, Iran's economy has grown a little recently. It really took a hit after the Trump administration you put all these sanctions on, but it's kind of slowly been growing. So they are getting by, and so that could be their long-term plan, no matter what happens with these negotiations, and it would make sense to do that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess, Iran has several examples looking at Russia, North Korea, Iraq, Libya, all these places where, the U.S. either just opposes sanctions completely arbitrarily or says they're going to remove them and then walks back on it even after the concessions are made. They have their own example. And so it seems like Iran probably won't open its economy up and, become like supply chain dependent for things it needs to keep its civilians alive on anyone that could be sanctioned by the United States. And so that basically means just the other countries that are so heavily sanctioned that they're willing to trade, which mostly includes Russia, although I think there's still some hesitation there because they don't face the same kind of sanctions that like Venezuela does, which is doing a lot more trade with Iran. And apparently Iran has helped Venezuela to increase its oil export, double it in 2021 with what Iran is shipping to Venezuela. Dave, before we move on, just want to mention to the audience that me and Will Porter have a new article out on sanctions at the Libertarian Institute today. So if you want to go over there and check that out. But Dave, the most important thing I want to talk to you about on today's show is this growing problem of China Houthis, and they're so often now masqueraded as doves on the foreign policy issue. It's Tucker Carlson, it's Matt Gaetz, it's Joe Kent, it's all these people from all over the political spectrum, Tulsi Gabbard, who are good on particular war issues. So, they want to get out of war in the Middle East. They don't want conflict with Russia over Ukraine, but it's all in the context of China, China, China. We got to worry about China. And so what the hell is going on here? I know that this seems to be for you, just like with myself, Connor Freeman, Patrick McFarlane. We've done shows on it, like a real like problem and something that's really getting under your skin a little bit. So I'll show people a couple of recent tweets that you've had recently, but yeah, I'll just let you take it off and say what you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a big problem, and it's really kind of powerful, I think, this type of like rhetoric, because you have Tucker, he's doing these segments on calling out the military industrial complex. They're the ones who benefit from war with Russia, and you have him, one of the few people to cover the OPCW leaks, and cover Assange, favorably cover Julian Assange. So that's given him, a lot of credit. So for the millions of people that watch his show, and I mean, this stuff, some aspect of it is great. Like senators have been getting calls from like old Republicans telling them not to go to war over Ukraine. I mean, that's great. And now Tucker, I shouldn't say, I used to watch Tucker a lot more, and he was really bad on China. And I'm not really sure how much of his Russia stuff is we can't do this because of China. I know he like slips it in, but I know that's definitely a part of his whole, shtick there. But Matt Gaetz, what he said the other day, and that is a perfect example of it. It's like, China is growing, and a rising China. They're the biggest threat to us, so we have to focus on that area, and that's the way everything is going. You know, Barring like a major escalation over Ukraine, the U.S. might send a few more thousand troops to Eastern Europe as they are, and they're signing deals to. They just signed a deal with Slovakia to use their air bases for 10 years, but even as that's happening, the shift is the pivot. They are really trying to do the pivot to Asia this time, and this was laid out under the Trump administration, and this goes back years and years. Obama wanted to do it, but he started it. He did it to an extent, but he started some more wars in the Middle East. But this, and even NATO has said that it has to focus more on China and Asia. So that's why it's such a major issue to me, because it's not like this is a fringe. It's not like nobody's talking about China. This is kind of the way they try to portray it. Guys like Tucker and Gaetz and a lot of kind of mainstream right wingers, everybody's talking about China. The New York Times, CNN, everything is about, it's been China, 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 China. So again, why this is powerful. You watch Tucker rail against the mic and all this stuff, and play Victoria Nuland's leaked phone call and explain the coup in Ukraine. And then when he's like, "Whoa, well, South China Sea, we got to be there," that gives it more kind of. He has more credit to say that, instead of just like Tom Cotton, who's just warmongering all the time. It's like textbook, like kind of misdirection, limited hangout stuff, like. And I'm not saying that they're all like in on this like big psyop or anything, but this is the way that the Pentagon and the establishment wants to go. I think they want to really. It's tough to say what they want to do with Russia. I really don't know. I'm not the best at analyzing all that, but they definitely want to keep things really. They want to be right up against Russia. They want as much influence in Ukraine, and Ukraine to be armed as much as possible without starting a full-blown war, I would like to think, because even the craziest hawks know that we can't go to war with Russia. And most people recognize that. And we just need more people to recognize that we also can't go to war with China there's no scenario in which it would be worth it, and especially over Taiwan. I mean, how can you justify risking nuclear war over Taiwan? I just don't understand it, but a lot of people seem ready for that.
All right, let me ask you one question about the Russia thing, and then we'll focus on the China stuff.
Yeah,
but so anyways, I pretty much agree with you. I think if you were to ask, like, just generally poll Congress and things like that, that most of them are far more concerned about China. Same thing with, the think tankers and the like the congressional staffers and everything like that. However, I'm worried that we have a couple people, particularly dangerous people in the Biden administration, who disagree and who are more concerned about Russia, and those being Jade Sullivan and Victoria Nuland. And we have Sullivan recently saying that, while it would be a catastrophe for Russia to invade Ukraine, the U.S. would see it as a strategic victory. And so, as much as they know that they're not going to actually fight a war, that Biden has made it very clear that we're not sending troops to Ukraine, I do think that there are people within the administration who see an opportunity to score a victory against Putin, to, I think, maybe give Putin a Soviet Afghanistan, to
Hmm.
use not such a great analogy, and this be a real problem, and something that we really have to contend with. And that, that's one of the reasons on the show I focused so much on Russia over the past few weeks, despite the fact that I think overall I do agree with you that the bigger concern, and a lot more attention and money is going to be spent at the very least over the confrontation with China.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's definitely possible that there is definitely a lot of elements in the Biden administration that want to suck Russia into a major war in Ukraine, just to hurt Putin and hurt the Russian economy. Then they could do these sanctions, cut off the gas trade between the EU and Russia. That all pisses them off. So yeah, I'm not saying that the Russia stuff is nothing. I mean, the Russia stuff is huge. It's everything. It's what we've been focusing on mostly for the past few weeks, as you have too. I don't want to downplay that at all. I mean, like in the long term, in like 10 to 20 years, 15 to 20 years, it's going to be kind of a slow buildup in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific, and that, especially as if we decouple more, if we take those steps, and just the fact that there really is no opposition in Congress to this idea that we have to face China, we have to stop China, contain them, or whatever. Um, so even Ro he's not like a hawk. I wouldn't say he's a China hawk, but he said, "Oh, China's rise and the threat of them invading Taiwan is a reason why we shouldn't get bogged down in Eastern Europe." But it's interesting because he was in the same thread. He's arguing that Ukraine should be non-aligned because that would make the chance of a conflict less likely if Ukraine was not aligned with NATO and the U.S. Even though they're not part of NATO, they are, aligned with these Western powers. And just take that logic and apply it to Taiwan. Again, Taiwan doesn't have official ties with the U.S., but the more it is aligned with the U.S. and NATO now, and Australia and the U.K. and all these European countries that are making their presence more known over there, that's going to make conflict with China more likely. Like, it's kind of an obvious conclusion to draw, I think. So, and it's the same thing with Tucker and all these people. Apply the logic. They say Taiwan, they have their chips, semiconductors, but you know, China is still one of our top trading partners. There's not a reason to think that they would take Taiwan and then hoard all the chips unless we were going to war with them. So it's another reason why we shouldn't. And I do think it's smart to diversify supply chains and stuff, not the way that Congress is trying to do it by like passing this huge $250 billion China Competition Act that's full of like it. Have you looked at that thing? It's like 1,100, 1,200 pages.
I know there's about 2 billion in military funding in there, a lot going to semiconductors. It is one of those things, Dave, where people somehow pretend like there's some like magical thing about Taiwan, like you get a production bonus on your semiconductors to make them on that particular island. Where, I do understand that it's not like, you could literally pick up and move the facility to the United States in 3 weeks or something like that, but if the entire economy is, dependent on semiconductors. Somebody's got to figure out how to make semiconductors in a place that isn't invaded by China pretty damn quick if there's a shortage on the global market, assuming the government doesn't prevent that from happening.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. um, but yeah, I mean, there's something about Taiwan. It like really kind of triggers people, if that's the right word. Like me saying what I said, like what I think is the U.S. I think the U.S. should stop selling weapons to Taiwan and let them in China figure it out, which is like a pretty radical view. That would set a lot of people off. But realistically, because that's not going to happen that way, there is like a realist way, I guess. They could slow down on the arms sales and kind of just encourage Taiwan and China to work out some kind of deal. And again, I think China, the more the U.S. supports Taiwan, the less likely this is going to happen. But I think China, especially after the diplomatic shift back in 1979, if there was definitely a window there for, just like a handshake. Oh yeah, you're part of China, and we're not going to threaten you with invasion and stuff. You're a autonomous province. Everybody says, "Oh, Hong Kong," but it's very different than Hong Kong. It's an island with a military. I probably, I I probably said this the last time I was on here too, but I just think it's an important point to make, and people are kind of afraid to make it, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point to make, Dave. And this is one that they're an odd thing too, where the official policy is a one China policy, that Taiwan and China are a part of the same political, like, you draw the line about around both things as one country. That's the way the US policy in law is. That is the like official post World War II world order of things. And so
Hmm.
you had this very interesting thing where the US is throwing an absolute fit about any borders changing in Ukraine at all, and yet at the same time they're trying to change, or it seems like they're trying to make it official policy to change the borders of Taiwan to make it its own independent state. And so I was just wondering, where do you think we are on that path, moving away from the one China policy and into actually supporting a independent armed American proxy state of Taiwan?
I still, I think that that's really officially changing that policy is still a long ways off, at least another administration or two, maybe. But it could also be accelerated by, a major incident in the region. And, with the presence of the U.S. military so close to China now, a major incident could happen. And, but this is, they want to give Taiwan a lot of hawks in Congress. They want to give Taiwan start giving them military aid, billions each year. And just as they do each little step is a step closer to that, I guess, to recognizing Taiwan as a country. But again, I still think because the implication there, I mean, China has basically said if Taiwan declares independence, we're invading. Now, would they do it right away if it happened? It's tough to say, but that's the risk that the U.S. would be taking by doing that. So I don't. Maybe 5 to 10 years, they'll start really entertaining that possibility.
Right. And China, like, as far as you could tell, has no plans to actually, as the status quo exists now, invade Taiwan, right? Because there's recently, we were talking about this on an episode Timcast, where one of the hosts there, the libertarian host, was saying that China has said that they will violently retake and invade Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, they don't rule out the use of force for reunification. That's what they've said the whole time. It's nothing new.
Yep.
So yeah, people can take that and extrapolate it, and then you also have there's their hawks in China, the Global Times, the English language. They're writing to a U.S. audience to be as hawkish as they can, and then the hawks in the U.S. grab that and say, "Look how crazy they are. Look at the rhetoric around Taiwan."
Uh,
So they all. play off each other.
I want to ask you about this one too. You put out a tweet, and this is something that you hear a lot, even from libertarians, that China is buying up so much farmland in the United States, and you got a good tweet here debunking that. So what's going on with this claim, and what's the truth?
I mean, that was just like a quick Google search. It's very easy to figure out that that is um, just kind of just nonsense, really. So according to USDA data from 2019, China owns about 200,000 acres of farmland in the U.S., and that's like just a fraction of a percent, because there's about 35 million acres of U.S. farmland. And if you look at, I'm not sure of all the numbers, but if like France owns way more than that, and individual billionaires in the U.S., they own a lot of farmland. Farmland is a good place to park money. It averages. I mean, I don't have the money to invest in farmland, unfortunately, but I've researched it myself as a future investment. It's an average 11% return. You park your money there, and it's a good hedge on inflation. So if you think about China, how big it is, and they're one of our top trading partners, it makes sense that they would invest. The one point that I'll give some of these people like Tucker Carlson is that we can't invest in Chinese farmland, so why can they invest in ours? And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe, there's something to that, but it's not like they're controlling our farmland. It's just like a total like fake talking point.
Yeah. I wanted to mention, Dave, that Joe Kent, who gets some love sometimes from people in our circles, was retweeted Matt Gaetz, criticizing the China Russia policy because we have to confront China, and we have from Joe Kent, this is exactly right. Anyone arguing for a confrontation with Russia and Europe is utterly, seriously dangerous. The CCP is the threat. We need a strong and independent economy to confront them. Decoupling from China must be our number one national security priority. And so I got to ask you about this decoupling thing, because to me it is a real threat. Like, if they could seriously start to decouple from China, then, as stupid as it sounds, because there are still nuclear weapons involved, I think they could seriously start talking about really going to war with China, or at least like picking fights in the South China Sea and things like that, because again, it won't destroy the American economy. So, do you see this happening at all? I guess it just seems so unbelievable to me that I
Yeah.
don't think it will, but what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would take a lot, but I mean, that is another talking point that you hear. Tom Cotton put out like a plan for decoupling, uh, and you see it more with some of these type like Joe Kent types. So I mean, you have to think about what it would take, and there's economists that are better at talking about this than me. Just what it would really take to decouple our economies that are totally intertwined. I mean, it would be a huge, massive shift, and there is a shift happening on some level. I mean, you see this with the bill that Biden passed recently that bans imports from Xinjiang. Um, these are major U.S. corporations that did business there that you assume have just huge influence in Congress, and they couldn't get this bill squashed, and everybody except for Thomas Massie voted in favor of it. It's a near unanimous consensus to start doing these things. Again, it would take to really do it. They have to really do it, and it would take a long time. And there's a lot of business interests in the U.S. that don't want it to happen, and they're going to be fighting it. And then you also have obviously the military industrial complex side of it, who they're interested in increasing tensions with China as much as possible. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes, but it would take a lot. But if it really happens, then war is likely, I would say.
So, last question, Dave, and I think this is maybe one of the most major points that we face right now, and that is the Uyghur genocide narrative has just become all the way embedded. as you said, almost every member of Congress has said Massey, and I don't think his objection was like, I don't think there's a genocide in Xinjiang, China. And so everybody believes this. Reason Magazine repeats it in nearly every article they write on China. That's a libertarian outlet. It's just commonplace to say, like, yeah, there's a genocide in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. Not that anybody could really find that on a map, knows what a Uyghur is, or understands what the actual claims are, where they originate from, and all of that. But yet it gets repeated, and the claim is going to be that the line from the Houthis is going to be, until the CCP starts to treat their Uyghurs better, then we can't do business with them. We can't unroll this trade war. We can't de-escalate tensions. We have to confront them everywhere, because look how bad and awful and Hitlerian the CCP has become. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I'm sure all of the people hate listening are the Uyghurs right now.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the big talking point, and it's one of those situations. It's like there's never going to be any convincing the U.S., like, either the mainstream media or the people that are already convinced about the genocide narrative. Because no matter what China does, they're going to say, oh, it's propaganda. If they let the UN in, say, for inspections, which sounds, scarily familiar. And they say, oh, there's no genocide. They're good. Nobody's going to believe it. They're going to say, oh, it was a controlled trip. So, if you look at the Olympics, they had a Uyghur or something as a torchbearer, and everybody freaked out about it. And they said, oh, they're rubbing it in our faces, but it's like, I think they had a Uyghur in 2008 do it too. And it's like, it's the Chinese government. They're doing this. They've pretty much just applied their child limits to the Uyghurs in recent years, and the data has been manipulated to show that it's a genocide. And it's not like it's a good thing that they're doing. And they're paying for their one-child policy, and their population is really on the decline, and that's going to be a big problem for them. But it's just it's an unprovable. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, there's no convincing people that it's not a genocide now. It's
too hard to disprove that negative for people who so deeply believe it. It's like this crazy thing they have going on right now with I think her name's pronounced Peng Shuai, the tennis player, who...
Yeah, that's a perfect example of what I mean.
Everybody at the Australian Open is wearing these "Where is Peng Shuai" tennis shirts, right?
And she's like right there.
Right. And this poor woman did not allege that she was sexually assaulted. Nothing in her letter says that anything non-consensual happens. It sounds far more like a Monica Lewinsky situation, where maybe the only difference would be the guy initiated the... I don't know if Clinton did or not, but the CCP party member did initiate the relationship. But she was hurt because she realized that he was using her for sex. But it was in a way that happens, not in a he pinned her down because he had CCP guards and things like that. He just misled her about, his feelings for her and what he actually thought about her. And, it seems pretty, I don't know, damaging to the feminist movement to take a woman's non-rape story and turn it into a rape story for geopolitical reasons. But, this is still being amplified at the Olympics and everything. And, I saw that torchbearer story about the Uyghur torchbearer, and I was like, if they didn't have a Uyghur torchbearer, then why is China hiding its Uyghur population during the Olympics? And that would have been the narrative. And, that's not to say that the Uyghurs don't live lives at a lower level than the Han Chinese, and that there's not particular policies that do harm them and things like that. But I mean, if you really feel the need to call that thing out, then focus on what's happening in the US. And I mean, people are like, well, would you want to be a Uyghur? No, but if we're being really honest, and if you ask some Chinese guy, would you rather be black or white in America, which one do you think he's gonna pick? Right? that is kind of a truth of the situation too, and it just seems so absurd that so many people are focused on the plight of the Uyghurs and have absolutely no concern about anything going on in the United States, are so willing to say, well, Xi or Putin's a thug, but then when you talk about Biden, you had to say like, oh, like he's an all right guy, he's trying. It's kind of complicated, there's historical policies here, he has to deal with the Trump court appointees and everything, and it's unbelievable. But anything you got before we wrap up here, Dave?
Um, no, that's really it, I think. But yeah, with the China stuff, it really is kind of amusing to see how they spin it. And the same way, everybody's convinced anything coming out of China is propaganda. You have to keep in mind the Western media, just everything that they put out about China and Russia right now, like just take with a grain of salt and kind of look into it a little more. Because a lot of times it's really easy to figure out that it's nonsense, like that farmland thing. Um, so, uh, yeah, don't just believe everything you read about China and Russia.
All right. And by the way, there's a pretty good article that Caitlin Johnstone has out today on this phenomenon of,
Oh
the
yeah,
people good on Russia and bad on China. And I got to say, mention that because she does link to and embed you're retweeting my tweet about Reason in there. So,
yeah.
thanks for giving that a little bit of extra platform there, Caitlin. And anyways, Dave DeCamp, at DeCamp Dave on Twitter, right? Your
Yeah,
last
yeah.
name first. You're the news editor at antiwar.com, and so there's 4, 5, 6, some absurd number of short news pieces from you every day on the homepage at antiwar.com that everybody should check out, covering everything. I know you probably have maybe a little bit more specific focus on China, but you really do cover everything, Dave. And what you and Jason do there is so important. So everybody be sure to
Thank you.
check out antiwar.com and follow Dave on Twitter.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Dave.